You're watching Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Now, November's been a month of key diplomatic meetings for the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, following its announcement of South Korea's own Indo-Pacific Strategy that pursues peace and stability in the region. Also, President Yoon on Wednesday highlighted the role of diplomacy to help increase the country's flailing exports and also pave the way for the expansion of business overseas. We discussed the country's diplomatic standing and where it should be headed today. And for this, we turn to Jeffrey Robertson, Associate Professor of Diplomatic Studies at Yonsei University, and Jun-sok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Very warm welcome to you both.
Happy to be here.
Lovely to see you, Professor Yang, and Professor Robertson, of course. So my first question is to you, Professor Robertson. Now, the new government's been talking about their new global pivotal state vision, the whole GPS vision, as South Korea's new diplomatic way forward. So how has this vision been perceived abroad, and what are your thoughts on the country's new Indo-Pacific strategy?
Well, I think the global pivotal states vision was initially received very positively. It had all the key words: international responsibility, democracy, rule of law, and human rights. But between the time when it was initially released and now, interest has somewhat waned. South Korea's rather played a different role. It's played the global cautious state role on a range of issues, from Xinjiang to South China Sea to Myanmar to Taiwan. South Korea has played a very cautious role, and Ukraine is a perfect example. A global pivotal state should really be playing a very large role on the Ukraine. South Korea has played a very careful role. Now, when we've come to the most recent expression of the global pivotal state idea, the Indo-Pacific Strategy, the Indo-Pacific Strategy was launched in a presidential speech rather than a physical document. This is a very cautious strategy. It was launched in the midst of an ASEAN forum, again, a very cautious strategy. Putting these two together, South Korea is really playing the role of cautious pivotal states rather than global pivotal states. Now, admittedly, they're both very much works in progress, and it could well change. But what we're waiting for is for South Korea's policy action to meet its policy rhetoric.
Right, and in the past, South Korea's diplomacy was rather constrained to the United States, China, and of course regarding North Korea. And with this whole GPS vision, many anticipated that it would broaden its diplomatic outreach. But as ever, it seems that South Korea can't really escape the US-China the equation, the rivalry, and where that places Seoul. So, Professor Robertson, where do you think the country currently stands, and what do you think the way should be going forward?
Yeah, South Korea can never escape the US-China rivalry, no more than it can escape its geography. South Korea is currently sitting very precariously on the fence between the two, and this is a difficult strategy. In the long term, South Korea basically has three choices. It can choose to accept China's regional dominance, acquiesce to China's regional dominance. It could choose to be a bulwark of democracy and a bastion of US interests in the region, or it can remain as a fence-sitter and try to balance between China and the US. Now, obviously, South Korea is following this last strategy. But the problem is this last strategy gets more and more difficult as time goes on. And ultimately, it leads down a path towards South Korea developing into a very independent but neutral, potentially nuclear-armed state in East Asia. And this path is full of hurdles. It's not going to interest any state within the region, and it's going to have so many challenges that South Korea's diplomacy is going to transform over the next 5 to 10 years.
So the geopolitical climate surrounding South Korea has been rather difficult, and so have export conditions, trading conditions. Professor Yang, South Korea's exports shrank year on year in the month of October, and that's not something that was seen for over 2 years. Why did our main export item, semiconductors, do so badly, and what dangers does a continued decline in chip exports really mean for the South Korean economy?
Okay, well, semiconductors are about 20% of Korea's total exports, and about 40% of that goes to mainland China, and another 20% goes to Hong Kong. If we talk about it in terms of GDP, about 8 to 12% of Korean exports head to China. That means about 6 to 8% of Korean GDP actually depends on semiconductor exports to China and Hong Kong. So when China's production facilities are hit, like they did during the summer because of the zero COVID policy and the hot summer which shut down factories, that naturally reduces the Chinese demand for Korean semiconductors. And because of that, Korean exports seem to have been hit for the first 20 days of November compared to the 20 days of November last year. The semiconductor exports are down 29.4%. Now, the reason, the biggest reason seems to be the reduction of Chinese imports because of the zero corona policy and the factory shutdowns, but also the prices of semiconductors are currently falling. So even if Korea exports the same amount of semiconductors, the value is going to fall. And then the third is that there's sort of a glut in the global market for semiconductors right now because of the shortages that a lot of firms faced during 2020. A lot of firms have started hoarding semiconductors in late 2020 and 2021. So they probably now have a very large backlog of semiconductors, so they don't need to buy any new ones particularly. And then this is probably a very minor effect, but because of the friction between the United States and China, some high capacity chips are now banned from going into China, and that probably reduced the value and amount of semiconductors going to China as well. But also note that last year's export demand for semiconductors was extraordinarily large. That's because of the hoarding effect that I talked about earlier, as well as increases in production that China and the global economy had last year, especially for electronic products, because of the aftermath of the pandemic, where people work from home, and there was a lot of investment in servers, a lot of purchases of PCs. So some of this is just returning to normal compared to before the pandemic.
I see. And Professor Yang, well, most people would assume that a weaker currency means, it's generally good for exports. But why hasn't this really been the case for South Korea?
Well, some analysts do say that the current low exports are due to somewhat of a what's called a J-curve effect. The exports have not caught up to the lower exchange rates yet. Personally, though, I think the explanation lies elsewhere. Korea now, unlike, say, even 10 years ago, Korea exports a lot of technologically advanced goods. Those are not necessarily depend on price competitiveness. It depends more on quality competitiveness and what other kind of competitors Korea has, as well as global demand. For example, people buy smartphones and they don't particularly care that much about price competitiveness if the quality of the phones are good. So the exchange rate effect and the price effect doesn't really have as much to do with exports as it did in Korea's past. And then there's a global recession as well as the reduction of demand from China. So that has cut down demand for Korean exports. And then the exchange rate in some ways hurt against the value of Korean exports, because while the amount of Korean exports may even be the same, because of the lower exchange rate, the value of the Korean exports in terms of US dollars will go down, and that may be some of what's happening right now.
I see. And turning back to you, Professor Robertson, now South Korea opened its diplomatic mission to NATO last week. So what was really the motivation for South Korea in terms of, strengthening its ties while establishing an official mission there? And also, how meaningful is this for NATO countries?
Yeah, this is a very interesting one. There's a lot of rhetoric around it, and we really have to wade through this rhetoric to fully understand it. Korea's motivation is fairly simple. Korea is a supplier of cutting-edge military technology, cutting-edge military platforms, and NATO representation quite simply gives it increased access to these states at a time of heightened regional insecurity. How meaningful is it to NATO countries? Well, there's commentators who, reflecting their investment in Korea, would say that it's really important. But outside of these emotional takes, the opening of South Korea's mission to NATO will have not too much meaning to member states. It's like a car dealer opening a new dealership down the road. If you're riding your bicycle or catching a bus, a new car dealership is not going to be all that important. It doesn't mean much unless you're planning to buy a car. But when South Korea's policy rhetoric starts to match its policy actions, then it could totally be a different case.
I see. So we'll have to wait and see if it follows up on the sort of rhetoric that is issued. And well, Professor Yang, the government certainly hopes to turn South Korea into a weapons exporting nation. And well, would that save our export-dependent economy?
Probably not. The reason that the weapons exports are getting a lot of attention is that the growth rate is really, in some ways, amazing. Korea is currently the 9th largest weapons exporter if you take the period between 2016 and 2020. And of those increased exports, 55% is going to Asian and Oceania countries, 23% to European countries, and 14% to Middle East countries. And for 2016 and 2020, the market share of Korea in the total weapons market is around 2.7%, and Korea is targeting that Korea should have the global weapons export market raise the percentage up to 5% by 2027. Now, this sounds very good, but then if you look at the actual export value, it's not really that high. Nikkei Asia cites Korean Export-Import Bank. The weapons export for Korea is only about $7 billion US dollars. So considering the total 2021 exports of $644 billion, the weapons exports are only about 1% of Korea's total exports. And even if Korea doubles the weapons share in the global economy, I doubt that it'll get higher than 2% of Korea's total exports. So it'll help here and there. It'll help certain companies like Hanwha, but whether it'll help turn around the entire Korean exports, probably not. You also have to remember that because these are weapons exports, Korea has to limit which countries and during which time periods that you can export these weapons to. So it'll never be, I think, a very wide, very large market. But again, for certain firms, it may do it may have some critical effect on certain firms which export weapons.
And Professor Robertson, well, maybe some are reading too much into this, but we've seen America's Indo-Pacific allies like South Korea and Australia engage in more and more arms trade deals with one another over the past year. Do you think there's any strategic meaning behind this?
Yeah, the arms trade is incredibly interesting, and it's good to contrast the economics and the politics. Just last week, President Yoon made a statement on the arms trade, and he noted that South Korea's arms exports are not only contributing to South Korea's defense and security, but also to international society's defense and security. Now that's, in political terms, rhetoric at the level of George Orwell. I mean, if a state really wants to contribute to international society's security and stability, then you contribute to international arms reduction, arms limitations, or arms reduction. I mean, you know, this talking about the arms trade, it's all profit. And that's what applies to South Korea's deals with Australia as well. Now, we can dress it up and paint it up in bright colors and imagine that there's some sort of strategic interaction between Australia and Korea. But, well, in the end, South Korea is a convenient supplier and Australia is an eager customer. Outside of these deals, Australia attracts little attention in Seoul and Korea attracts little attention in Canberra. So there's as much strategic meaning in South Korea and Australia's arms deals as there is in South Korea and Egypt, South Korea and Poland, South Korea and Indonesia. Not too much at all.
Well, there's certainly more to read into the flurry of diplomacy that South Korea has been taking on, whether it's based on commercial interests or reflects deeper geopolitical issues. But we'll have to wait and see how the government does in the years to come. And well, that was Jeffrey Robertson, Associate Professor of Diplomatic Studies at Yonsei University, and Jun-sok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Thank you both so much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you also to our viewers for tuning in. Global Insight will be back at the same time tomorrow here in South Korea, so do tune in then. Till then, have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.